lose yourself in a good book. The Board Gosh Energy Book Club.
Now, this month marks the 100-year anniversary of the 1916 Rising, as we all know, and women played a key and courageous role during the rebellion, yet many of those involved are rarely heard about or even known about.
Very true indeed. And today, author and historian Sinead McCool joins us to talk about her book, No Ordinary Women, and the vital role women played in 1916. Sinead, you're very welcome this morning.
Thank you, Sinead.
I've been having a look at your wonderful book, and it's interesting, we were chatting there, you're a curator by trade, I suppose. I know you've written this, and it is very much like an exhibition within a book, because it's not just the written word, you have items that the women owned. And tell us about the book in essence and what you want people to take from it.
Well, I suppose it's a combination between an overview of the history, taking it from 1900, when Maud Gonne set up the Daughters of Ireland, and then right through then to the end of the Civil War. And it's based around the women that were imprisoned later on, to sort of explain what happened in the Civil War and why approximately 1,000 women were actually interned by the state, the Irish Free State as it was. And so it takes in the period that we're now celebrating, and that is the period of the Rising, and explaining where the women were involved. It's a story that's sort of still evolving, because a lot more women are now coming to the fore with a lot of the new material and collections and that. So it's been updated to include more biographies. So now it has 90 women. So one of the things that when he started out, I would have been working on this maybe 1991, so we're nearly at 25 years. So I started off obviously in Kilmainham Jail, and a lot of the women were coming forward. People were still alive. Teresa O'Connell was one of the women that I interviewed over a 5-year period, because she lived to be 100.
Them.
And one of the things that people say is that is this idea that it's a very accessible book, because I'm telling their stories, but in the way of conversation and the way that it was. And women collect things, and for a long time people said that they weren't there and that there was nothing to tell. That was because they hadn't ended up in the public collections. So they weren't in the museums. They weren't in they were in people's homes and in people's drawers. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to give that feeling that if people even today pulled out a drawer and found something that maybe they could identify the brooch of Anine Heron, which was a large tower brooch, or they could find a little bit more about their families. And that's one of the things that's happened. So the book has grown with the changes.
Sinead, I'm considerably older than both of you, and I was educated in a different era.
Yeah, sure.
And it was an era that was actually quite nationalistic and Republican. And, I was 10 in 66, so that the 50-year anniversary was very, very important. And we read and were taught an awful lot about it. Other than Markovitz and Maud Gonne, there was almost no mention of women in the Rising whatsoever. And it was only in later life that I discovered the parts that women played. Why is it that they're only now being written back into the history?
Well, I suppose it's a little bit like what's in common knowledge, and I see them everywhere. So they were involved in the Red Cross. There are photographs in the Irish press with women marching alongside men. They weren't in the realm, they weren't in the cabinet, as we know. They didn't end up after Markovitz into the cabinet until the 1970s. They weren't in the influential roles in government or in public service in that way. So therefore, there wasn't sort of maybe an agenda, or there wasn't the interest in the media in the same way. But having said that, you do find them in the Irish press, in the accounts. You find them in An Tóglacht. You find them even in a book that was called "Men." Ireland's Fighting Story, told by the men who made it. There is an article in there on women. You do find them in the original accounts in 1916. For example, there is an article written by a Red Cross nurse talking about how they were fearless under fire. We now have a lot more from the pension records, and so you can find them that way. So what really the book is to set about is to help people to look and recognise the names of the more minor women, so that in turn that they'll see them in other places.
Yeah, because I was about to say, we always hear Maud Gonne and we hear Markovitz, and that might lead people to think that it was a certain type of woman who got involved, but it was women across all sectors of class and rank and education and privilege. It wasn't just the Maud Gonnes and the Markovitzes.
Well, it's really, really interesting, because one of the things is they were young women. And one of the things I always talk about is the whole idea of cultural markers now. And what I mean by that is, you and I are both called Sinead. And I don't know how much time you've sort of reflected on your name or different things like that, but I was born in 68. And I was indirectly called, in the States, I was born in New York, by my mother, an Irish name, because my surname was McCool. And the idea being that, she put names that matched the surname. But the idea of it was that that name was common and known known about because of Sinead de Valera, who in turn, if you wind the clock right back to the turn of the century, she's a member of Daughters of Ireland. She's involved in writing and producing plays in the Irish language. I think there's 152 documents in the National Library. And she was hugely into the Feshna and all the whole idea of promoting Irish culture, which was one of the objectives of the Daughters of Ireland. Yeah. So what I think about it is, and I can see now that you have a picture of her on screen in, an Irish Ireland costume. And when you think about our Irish Ireland and the whole notion of that it's really interesting. And actually, I'm doing a piece for RT for the Road to the Rising, and the idea is about fashion, and it's the idea that the Irish Ireland costume morphed into the Irish dancing dress. Yeah. So what I mean about it is, it's just about educating people in where the women were and where they went to.
It is extraordinary about Sinead de Valera, because de Valera obviously is the towering figure in Irish history during the 20th century and was considered to be exceptionally bright and all the rest of it. But Sinead de Valera was considered to be even brighter and even more intellectual than her husband. Which is
behind the throne, Mark, as always.
This is the other thing as well. When you think about the leaders, I mean, they were all inveterate letter writers, and these are young men who went off to war and to die for their country. They didn't do that in isolation. They did that with the full and 100% support of the women in their lives, their mothers, their sisters, their wives and their fiancés. And so those women were pivotal in their decision to do what they did.
But they didn't just play a supporting role either. I mean, they were out there fighting.
Well, we do have women who were involved and did take up guns, and we know of Margaret Skinner, and they're now, the term is being combatants, because combatants allows for intelligence gathering and all of that. And in some ways we see them as a secret army, because you don't tend to get the woman who's going to blab and talk to neighbours, who's going to be central to your organisation. And we know that about the War of Independence in particular, and that's in turn why so many women were in turn during the Civil War, is that the men who'd fought alongside them knew exactly who they were dealing with. So the British hadn't had that information. So now the number of women involved in the Rising is up at 300, which is substantial. But when you talk about the women in behind, the idea is that a lot of them, were telling their stories in later years to continue to elevate their husbands into hero status. So when you look at the material, you have to be really mindful of the fact that who's telling you the story, whether it's a detractor, where you're getting your source material for, and context. So one of the things I was really strong on was to try and give people a sense of what the time is like. And then, of course, you always want them to go on and do more. Or if they see a film that they're informed, or if they go and see The Bridge and Rosie Hackett, that they could pick up a book on their shelf and find the reference to explain to their children who they are.
It's a fascinating book. I'd love to see schools adopting it, and for young schoolgirls and schoolboys to be reading this would be fabulous. It's a wonderful book for any age, I think, and you've got wonderful items scattered throughout it. It is like a wonderful museum exhibit. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, and a lot of the material that's there, they're in Kilmainham Jail.
OK, yeah, absolutely. People can go and see it. No Ordinary Women, wonderful book by Sinead McCool, available now at Brian Press. Thank you very much, Sinead.
Now, last week we launched our 1916 short story competition. We're looking for your 500-word stories, fact or fiction, with a 1916 theme. The winning story will win a book club goodie bag versus tablet, and the winning story will also be published in the Irish Farmers Journal. So to enter, send your 500-word story to irelandm@tv3.ie or post them to Bord Gáis Energy Book Club, TV3, Westgate Business Park and Ballymount in Dublin 24. Details on your screen now. Get them into us by Friday, the 25th of March.
Now, coming up after the break, Pete the Vet joins us to talk about dental health of pets and give us some helpful tips on taking better care of our dog's teeth.
Lose yourself in a good book. The Bord Gáis Energy Book Club.